is why you always want to make sure people's clothing is out of the way when you make them. Are we good, Shannon?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody, this is just about the happiest day of the entire year. Welcome, students, colleagues, family, friends, honored guests, to the 17th thesis day of the MIT graduate program in science writing. One thing, I'm Tom Levinson. I am the acting director of the program this term and a professor of science writing here. The regular director, Seth Mnookin, is suffering serious back issues and horrible things are happening to his musculoskeletal structure, and he is basically confined to about 6 square feet in his home. And he is really, really, really sorry not to be here. He sends each of the students his best, wishes you well, and really wanted me to communicate to you his regret in not being here. But I'm extremely happy to be here, as are all those associated with the graduate program in science writing. I'm going to get out of the way very quickly, because the real purpose of the day is to discover and celebrate the work of our wonderful students. What you're going to be hearing about today, for those of you who are not our students, wonderful and hardworking, is a presentation on their theses, which represents actually more than the school year's worth of work. We actually ask our students as applicants to propose thesis ideas. Then during the summer, before they come, we write to them and say, think more about your thesis ideas, develop them, and then within the first week or two of class, we start pushing them to actually take what had been, oh, this would be fun, in the pre-process, and turn them into a project that can sustain their interest and reward their month after month of work with a project that is deep and rich and meaningful and expresses something new about some important facet of science and the world. And this they have all done. And you know, every year it's wonderful to see what comes out. Every year it's exciting to see how much exciting stuff they have found. It's exciting to hear the stories of how they found it. You will hear in the presentations of the travel and the trials and the tribulations and the phone calls that weren't answered and the phone calls that were and led them in new directions and this kind of thing. And all this is to emphasize to parents and friends that there is extraordinary amounts of physical toil, mental effort, and great creative skill deployed in the service of these projects. And we couldn't be happier to hear about them and more proud of them for getting them done to such high standards. So, all that said, I think the thing to do is to get out of the way and let us start enjoying what is, after all, the main event. So the first thesis we're going to hear about has the terrifying title, Plague of Absence, and it is the work of our student class of 2019, Eva Frederick.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Eva, and today I'm going to be talking about what some people have called the insect apocalypse. And so before we get started, I just had to show this picture of me as a kid. I've loved bugs since I was like 3, I think, and this is me wearing one of those horrible Museum of Natural History shirts with bugs all over it, so it's like the only time it's relevant. Anyway, so back to insect declines. So it's hard to tell exactly when this story started, but over the last couple of decades, people have been noticing something strange when they go on long drives. So in the 70s and 80s, even a short drive would leave your windshield like this, splattered with bugs, just really gross. But when I drove from Texas to Boston here in the summer, my windshield was like totally clean, maybe one big bug and a couple of little ones. It's just like a really big difference from how it used to be, according to people who saw that. And then other anecdotal accounts just kept cropping up. People in many places were noticing that there were just less insects. And so this started getting media attention in 2017 when a study in Germany came out showing declines of up to 80% in insect populations, and this is in protected areas, so in parks and nature preserves, places you'd think insects would be thriving. And then over the past 2 years, more studies come out, or have come out in other places, so you've probably seen headlines like this, "The insect apocalypse is here, why insect populations are plummeting." It was just really scary. And also one review study came out saying that 40% of insect species are threatened with extinction over the next few decades, which is crazy. So as soon as I saw the headlines, I knew I wanted to learn more and I wanted to write about this in some way, one way or another. Because if insects are really declining as severely as these studies suggest, ecosystems and the global food supply are in jeopardy. Insects are important in so many ways. They're food for all sorts of animals, they pollinate many important crops, and they provide billions of dollars of ecosystem services, which can range from pollination to weird stuff you wouldn't think of like dung burial, like literally billions of dollars of ecosystem services in just dung beetles burying dung, and other things too, like pest control. So I wanted to see how serious these declines actually were and when we could actually expect to see the effects in our day-to-day lives. And trying to answer that question has led me to talk to all sorts of people, from monarch researchers, and monarchs are sadly trending downward, to plant scientists in California who are probably the only people in the world to notice the absence of spittle bugs, to insect risk assessment specialists in Montana, to ecologists in Costa Rica. And I've learned a lot about insects and ecosystems, but also that straightforward sounding stories like this are not always as simple as they seem. And there's some pretty crazy predictions out there, as you saw, but first of all, I want to set something straight. There's absolutely no way that all insects will die out in the next few decades. Barring a global catastrophe like a meteor strike, we'll still have bugs in 2070. But that doesn't mean that we'll have the same bugs or that these declines aren't a huge problem. So anyway, after I started researching, I began looking for scientists doing on-the-ground work on insect populations because I wanted to come observe their research. And that's not as easy as you might think, especially since we travel in January for our program, and there aren't a whole lot of insects in North America, at least, in January. But finally I got lucky, and I called a graduate student at the University of Nevada, Reno, named Danielle Salcido, and she's studying caterpillars and parasitic wasps at La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica. So there you can see it in the northeast there. And every year, Danny and her advisor, Lee Dyer, a tropical ecologist and chemist, take a team of Earthwatch volunteers out to collect caterpillars to add to a long-term data set. Lee and Danny study multi-trophic interactions in the tropics, which are pretty crazy. So caterpillars eat plants, that's one trophic level. And then parasitoids, which are generally wasps and flies, lay their eggs in caterpillars, so that's another. And then sometimes another kind of wasp comes and feels every caterpillar to see if it has wasp larvae inside, and then lays its eggs inside the wasp larva inside the caterpillar. So things get pretty weird. So as it turns out, Danny and Lee had been seeing insect declines themselves. And I'm going to read a short section from my thesis about one of the ways researchers at La Selva started seeing a difference in the insect populations there. So Lee Dyer and other researchers at La Selva first noticed the absence through a popular evening activity for entomologists, blacklighting. The La Selva blacklighting setup is a blank expanse of white sheet stretched taut across a metal frame. Overhead, a tin roof protects the sheet from rain. Each night, as the sun sinks below the tangle of the surrounding forest, UV lights above the sheet blink on. In years past, as the lights illuminated the fabric, it began to come alive with insects. After a while, the white sheet would be almost black with crawling, fluttering life, and the space around it would host a small cloud of activity, much like the cones of light cast by suburban streetlights. As the sheet filled up with moths and beetles, the space around the sheet would fill up with researchers. Here, Dyer says, a particular scientist, tired of unwanted attention from her male coworkers, used to eat insects to garner their disgust. Not clear if that worked or not. And students and professors alike would fight over who got to add which species to their ever-expanding insect collections. In the early morning, after the howler monkeys deep in the woods began their guttural screams, the lights would blink off again and the insects would return to the forest. That was in the 90s. A casual observer nowadays would be lucky to see a few dozen insects. When I went out to look at the sheet one night in January of 2019, I saw fewer than that. As I ventured close to the fabric, I saw a scattering of tiny winged things clinging to the sheet, and 3 medium-sized moths sitting primly, wings neatly folded behind them like elegant vintage coats. One larger one, as I approached it with my camera, arched its abdomen and raised its wings in a gesture of defiance. I considered myself lucky to have seen these few creatures. That's how the concept of shifting baselines works. If you hadn't seen the sheet before, you'd be impressed. You'd never know, unless someone told you, that this sheet was once a churning mass of 6-legged life. So researchers at La Selva could see these declines, but they hadn't really quantified them, and that's where Lee and Danny come in. Lee's been collecting caterpillars for a long-term data set since 1991. Since they started the project, Lee, Danny, and many volunteers have collected thousands of individual caterpillars from around 4,500 species, which is just under half the estimated number that are at La Selva, which is pretty crazy. And they raise them to see whether or not they've been parasitized. And they document the percentage that have been parasitized by wasps, and they use this number to make estimates about the health of both species. So for example, if fewer wasps are killing caterpillars, which is true according to the data set, then you would think that the caterpillar populations would be growing. But in their analysis, the researchers discovered something surprising. The number of caterpillars at La Selva is actually decreasing. And here's a quote from Lee on that. I was really surprised at how big the decline in parasitism was, especially in the diversity of parasitoids. The magnitude of effect was something I would never have predicted at all. We're still doing the analyses, so maybe it's not as bad as it looks, but it looks pretty bad right now. After talking on the phone with Danny, she offered to let me tag along on their January collecting trip. So just before New Year's, I left the cold Boston weather, flew into San Jose, Costa Rica, and rode with the team for 2 hours northeast through the mountains to the station. And here's a picture of the cabin we stayed in at La Selva. It's just like super pretty, nestled in the forest. And so basically when we were there, we were just going out on these long treks to collect caterpillars. We'd just look everywhere. Sometimes we'd look for specific kinds. Sometimes we'd just look for any kind. And we'd put them in these plastic bags, and then we'd take the bags back to the lab, and that's where they would live. We'd raise them in there, and Danny would take care of them. We made sure they had the plants they needed to eat. And there's some of the researchers looking at a caterpillar. And that one actually was parasitized, but by a fungus, so it wasn't relevant to the data set, but it's still interesting. And here are some of the other ones. Oh, also we would take pictures of them because they had a camera set up. So here's some wacky caterpillars that we saw. Crazy. Okay, so like I said, we would go out and collect caterpillars, and then sometimes we would be looking for a specific kind. So here's another section of my thesis about one kind of caterpillar. So we set off down one of La Selva's shady trails and spread out into the woods on either side, our feet shuffling through muddy leaf litter. While I searched the undersides of leaves, Julie Elliott, an eagle-eyed caterpillar hunter from Tennessee, was determined to find a sphingid. Sphingid caterpillars are legendary at La Selva. First of all, they're enormous. Some are as long as a person's middle finger. Second, they come in all sorts of fascinating varieties. One, when approached by a predator, flips upside down to display a head that looks startlingly like that of a viper. Another has a round blue face and a red spike on its back, and you can see it right there. When mature, many types of sphingid will emerge as huge brown hawk moths with dagger-like wings swirled with the pattern of Damascus steel. Elliott was not in luck that day, though. In fact, there are some types of sphingid that hardly anyone in Dyer's group has been lucky enough to find at La Selva in several years. The one with the baby blue head and red tail, it's been at least 10 years since I've seen that, he said. The sphingids were never that common, at least not as common as some other caterpillars lurking in La Selva. If you're looking for a parameter, the slope of the decline doesn't seem dramatic because there weren't that many there in the first place, Lee said. What's really dramatic is I just don't see them anymore. And I talked to Lee the other day, and he told me that actually there's lots of species of sphingid that are declining, so not just this one. So at this point, you're probably wondering why these insects are dying. What is causing this? And so here, I'm going to go over a few causes. There are actually many human-caused factors involved in these declines, and they are different depending on where you are and what kind of insects you're looking at. But some of the most important factors are activities that cause loss of habitat. So urbanization and human expansion is a really big one, because there's just not enough place for the insects to live anymore. Same with deforestation. And then agriculture is doubly bad because not only does it get rid of insect habitat, but it also puts pesticides and other chemicals into the environment, which can be really harmful. And then climate change. And that can be, some insects, it's good for them, some it's bad for them, so it's really just depends on the kind of insect. In La Selva, it's probably pesticides and climate-induced weather changes that are to blame for the insect declines. And one of my sources had a great quote about all these varied causes. David Wagner is an entomologist at the University of Connecticut. He said, "It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's pollution, it's invasive species, it's climate change, it's pesticides, it's pathogens being moved around by global commerce." And that's what really sucks, because if it were one thing, we could try to correct it. And of course, we can try to correct it, and some people are, but it's hard to deny that the number of factors involved in these declines is daunting. So there are a couple things I do want to make clear about insect declines that I've learned while reporting this thesis. And this story has been sensationalized quite a bit, as you saw in the headlines. And we see these stories that spell doom for insects everywhere, and it's really scary, but that's actually a little bit misleading. So insects are declining in many places, but they're not declining in all places. For example, Lee Dyer collects caterpillars in Costa Rica, where they're declining, but he also collects them in Ecuador, where the populations are stable. So it just depends on where you are. And I think that's probably because there's not as much agriculture surrounding the site in Ecuador, but we're not sure yet. And then also, not every species is declining or is likely to decline. A review study came out this year predicting that 40% of insect species are in danger of going extinct, but even review studies can't cover the entire world, and there are lots of insect species we haven't even identified yet. And so any study like that is definitely biased by taxa, the ones you can find easily, and also by location where you can do studies. Anyway, so yeah, not all insect species are declining. And some will persist, especially those that thrive on human disturbance, like mosquitoes, unfortunately. And a lot of agricultural pests will also thrive due to climate change because they like it when it's warmer. So it's not so much an issue of the sheer number of insects declining, but it's the diversity that will suffer. And one last thing I tried to make clear in my thesis is that this topic is extremely nuanced. Insect populations are incredibly important and incredibly difficult to study. There's not enough data, the existing data is difficult to interpret, and besides, insects are so varied. It's tempting to paint insect declines with a broad brush, but that just doesn't work. So declines in biodiversity are definitely bad for ecosystems, and this is not a problem we should ignore. But like every issue, we need to think critically about it and take sensational claims with a grain of salt. And to conclude, I'm going to read one last passage from my thesis. And this is after we have been collecting all day and we're just coming back to the lab in the evening. I unhooked my new caterpillar-filled bags from around the strap of my backpack and spread them on the table. Next to me, Julie unloaded about twice the amount that I caught, including several Quadrus cerealis caterpillars. These are pale, translucent, worm-like creatures that create little leaf and silk homes like they're tucking themselves into bed. After they pupate, the Quadrus caterpillars emerge as soft, dusky moths that fly in the hazy sunlight of dawn. They gravitate towards liminal spaces, living just where the cover of the canopy opens into the wide cerulean sky, flitting easily between shade and sunlight. I was struck by how Quadrus cerealis, and all the caterpillars we found over the 3 days in the forest, fit so beautifully into its niche. As a caterpillar, it eats mostly plants in the piper family, which have finely tuned defenses against insect herbivores. Some species of piper host ant colonies within their hollow stems. Others defend themselves with a cocktail of chemicals. Somehow, these caterpillars are able to survive by eating only these plants. The interaction of the caterpillars with the plants and the wasps with the caterpillars is another example of intertwined species revealed by years of painstaking research, and a reminder of the many other interactions scientists have no idea of. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay Nature, writes about how a leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment of time, or the smallest insect is related to the whole and partakes of the perfection of the whole. Each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the world. I can see what Emerson means here in Costa Rica. Lee Dyer likens these tangled codependencies to novels, brilliant stories full of colorful characters and plots. Their gradual declines he compares to a slow-burning blaze. When we lose these interactions, we aren't only burning down libraries of books, Dyer said. We are burning books that have never been read before. Dyer said, there is nothing we can do to stabilize many of these species. The changes that are affecting insects and their interactions might be reversible on a timescale of 1,000 years, but we're still going to lose many of them in the meantime. But Dyer isn't discouraged. He wants to read those books so that he can pass along the stories that they contain. And that all sounds a little gloomy, but one thing that all the coverage on insect declines can show us is how much people actually appreciate and care about insects. We realize they're important to our lives in so many ways, and a story about them dying can serve as a wake-up call to the larger changes on our planet and what we can do to mitigate them. And then there are these people who are willing to dedicate, this is the team at La Selva that we're collecting this winter, and they were willing to dedicate their time and money to collecting caterpillars in Costa Rica with the hope of reading those books of species interactions and revealing the truth of what is going on in the insect world. So that was my presentation. I'd like to thank my thesis advisor, Alan Lightman, for all his help and the many drafts that I submitted. His edits were great. and also my boyfriend, Cano Briceño, for going to Costa Rica with me, and the class for all your helpful commentary. So yeah, thank you. Are there any questions?
Marcia?
Yeah.
Given it seems that there will be an insect apocalypse, what do they predict for the effects on our ecosystem? What is actually going to be happening to our ecosystem with the loss of these insects?
So yeah, it really depends on where you are. So in the US, most likely climate change is going to cause certain agricultural pests to proliferate because their metabolisms are faster when it's warmer, and some of them will have 2 generations of offspring a year. And some of the insects that are control on those pests, like wasps, are probably the ones that will be declining. So we'll probably have a larger threat to agriculture. And then in other ways, I guess just small decreases in the amount of ecosystem services. It's not going to be a crazy apocalypse. It's going to be shifts, just like there's shifts going on in lots of other ways due to climate change and other changes going on our planet. But yeah.
Great presentation, Eva. Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask a question. Is there any global protection programs like the Paris Accord or something that represents the global interest of insect populations?
I'm not sure. I know that the Entomological Society of America, their whole conference this year is based on insect declines, and they're really working to combat that and make sure that the research is solid and that people are doing the best they can to report it accurately. I'm not sure about a global protection agency, though.
My family lives up in Maine, and ticks have become a huge problem there in the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And with that comes Lyme disease. And so this seems like one of these shifts that you're talking about where some insects are actually proliferating. And so I was just wondering if you've heard about any efforts to control that and sort of shift it back to its natural balance, and also wondering about generally the effects that this trend could have on human health?
The ticks specifically?
The ticks and just shifts in insect populations generally.
Right. I don't know about control efforts, actually. I think it's very localized, so with agriculture, people will just be doing their own mitigation plans. With the ticks, I know that's climate change related, and I'm not sure if people are working on that. What was the other half of your question? I'm sorry.
Just generally, if you know of other examples of the effects that these shifts have on human health.
Right. I think mostly what I went over in the presentation, just kind of subtle. Also we're in the midst of the 6th global extinction, right, as you've probably heard. So there's going to be a lot of shifts to ecosystems, and insects are the foundation of a lot of ecosystems. So, for example, even bats and grizzly bears and all these species in different places in the U.S. depend really heavily on insects, and which is kind of surprising. So we'll probably see less of those creatures because it'll work its way up the food chain. Yeah.
This is kind of an oddball question, but I've been sort of particularly interested in and alarmed by the amphibian decline, and a lot of amphibians live on insects as well. Is there a connection between the two apocalypses, apocalypse? I don't know.
There may be. It might be related to that. I know that there's a fungus that's wiping out a lot of amphibians, the chytrid fungus. So I think probably they're mostly based on that, but insect declines would definitely have an effect on populations of amphibians. Any other questions?
All right, thank you. Next, please leave the mic is there.
Oh.
Leave the mic behind. You don't get to keep that all day. And our next thesis and presentation has the intriguing title, Mass Appeal, and will be delivered to you by Emily Makowski.
Hi everybody, I'm Emily and my thesis is on bananas and a fungus. But before I talk about that, I would first like to show you guys this baby picture of me. As you can see, I was a voracious reader even when I was little. This picture was put into my presentation at Gina's request, so thanks Gina. It's funny, my thesis is on bananas, but I didn't really like them when I was a kid. For a while when I was little, my parents, who are watching from the live stream right now, would put like 4 pieces of banana on a plate to try to get me to eat them, to try to get some kind of vitamins in me. This went on for several years and I hated it so much, but now I eat a banana for lunch like almost every day. So the banana story really starts with something strange that was happening on banana plantations in Taiwan in the 1960s. There were some plants that started to wilt, but even when they kept being given enough water and nutrients, they still didn't perk up. Instead, they just kept wilting and wilting until they died. And when people looked at cross-sections of the stems, these photos are actually from, they're newer photos, but they're the same symptoms. They found discoloration patterns like these. You can see that there's like this reddish, brown, dark discoloration. Normally it would be like a pale beige. And to farmers and scientists, these symptoms were troubling, but they weren't new. They'd seen something like this before. It was caused by a fungus called Fusarium oxysporum, which causes a disease called Fusarium wilt, or Panama disease. So the symptoms weren't the real problem. The real problem was that these symptoms were appearing in a type of bananas that had been called in to solve the Fusarium wilt problem in other parts of the world in the first place. So a little bit of background about Fusarium. It's a fungus. It's normally found in the soil, and it just kind of hangs out there and it doesn't cause harm to plants. But there are a few types that can cause disease, and they're actually classified into subtypes based on what kind of plants they attack. So there's ones that attack asparagus, there's ones that attack tomatoes and peas and coffee and carnations and even cannabis. It gets really specific. And of course, there's one that attacks banana plants. And so in banana plants, it's in the soil and it gets taken up by the roots, where it then spreads through the plant's vascular system. And that's the part of the plant that transports water and nutrients from the roots up the stem to the leaves of the plant. So as the fungus grows, it blocks off the vascular system, meaning that the plant can no longer get enough food and water, and the fungus becomes widespread, the plant wilts and it stops producing bananas, and then it dies. And to make things even worse, once it destroys the plants, it also stays in the soil for a really long time, for decades, for like 30 years. So if a farmer tries to plant a new plant on that land, it will also infect the new plant. And so Fusarium leaves farmers with a failed crop, but also with unusable land for a really long time. And there's no cure for it, and it can be really easily spread in the soil through just like a few soil particles on a worker's boot or a piece of equipment. So, but to fully understand why banana diseases are so devastating and why the arrival of this fungus in Taiwan in the 60s was so bad, we first have to look at how bananas have changed once humans started cultivating them. So on the left, you can see a wild banana. It looks very different from the supermarket banana that we have today. You can see that wild bananas have many seeds. They're very small. They still exist today, but we've also developed supermarket bananas from them. They don't provide a lot of fruit. And so over thousands of years, farmers cultivated them into what we have in the supermarket. And this made them very easy for people to eat, but it also radically changed the plants. So because bananas were bred to not have seeds, it means they're sterile. And even if they did have seeds, cultivated bananas are also triploid, which means that they have 3 sets of chromosomes instead of the usual 2. So they can't reproduce sexually. Instead, there's little offshoots that appear in the soil, and farmers dig them up and they replant them somewhere else. And that's how you get a new banana plant. So that means that these standard yellow bananas that we get in the supermarket are genetically identical. They're all basically clones of each other. In terms of food production, this is great. It means that one banana that we eat will be the same as the next, but it also means that what kills one banana of a certain type will pretty much kill them all. So this is the type of banana that we eat today. It's called the Cavendish, and it's the kind that we in the continental US get in supermarkets. Before that, there was a different type of banana called the Gros Michel. And when the banana export industry started in the late 19th century, the Gros Michel was chosen as the main type of exported banana because it held up really well to mass production, to transportation. And so the banana industry essentially created a monoculture where they mainly just exported this one fruit. But now during the early 1900s, Fusarium started to destroy banana plants and just decimate plantations in Latin America. And at this time, the Cavendish had been growing in Asia for thousands of years. And by the 1950s, the destruction of the Gros Michel was so bad that the banana industry finally just replaced it with the Cavendish. It was pretty similar to the Gros Michel, and it just held up really well to mass transport. But in the 1960s, which was only a decade or so after the Gros Michel had been replaced, farmers in Taiwan started seeing these symptoms on the Cavendish, which they had never seen before. And after a lot of testing, they realized it was a completely new strain or race of Fusarium, and they named it Tropical Race 4. The one that attacked the Gros Michel was called Tropical Race 1. There were a few others in between, but they weren't as devastating, so I'm not going to go into those. But TR4 has become a real problem. So this is the current distribution of TR4. It's spread all throughout different parts of the world. So the dark gray countries here are the countries that produce bananas. And the red triangles are where TR4 has been found. So you can see that it's spread all throughout places in Asia, in Australia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and it destroys Cavendish bananas everywhere it goes. It's estimated to have destroyed over 247,000 acres of land in Asia. And if it spreads to Latin America, the banana industry will be really hard hit. In places like Guatemala, Costa Rica, the Honduras, this would just be devastating for their economies. So I became interested in this fungal disease for many reasons, besides the fact that it's this huge global problem. Since I have a biology background, I'm interested in nature and food science and agriculture. And I had seen some articles out there already on this issue. But one way that I wanted to make my thesis different was to talk to banana farmers and to hear about their experiences. When I was thinking about all these things about bananas and banana plants, it all felt very abstract. And so I really wanted to go and just see the plants for myself. I felt it would be really invaluable to me as I was writing my story. And when I had started to think about topics for my thesis, I knew that there would be some travel involved. But I never dreamed that I would end up in Hawaii. I swear I wasn't trying to game the system by picking a thesis topic that would let me go to one of the most beautiful places in the world. And if it makes you feel any better, I was only there for like 2 days because my original flight got canceled due to a snowstorm. So now TR4 actually hasn't spread to Hawaii yet, but they have had a lot of problems with TR1, which is that original strain that attacked the Gros Michel. I wanted to know how farmers felt about the potential of TR4 spreading. And I also knew that a lot of different varieties of bananas are grown on Hawaii, and I wondered if that could maybe be some kind of answer to this problem, that instead of this monoculture, if many different types were grown, maybe that would be a way to help mitigate the disease. So when I went to Hawaii, I went to Pahoa, which is on the big island of Hawaii, and I also went to Haleiwa, which is on the north shore of Oahu. And I went to visit 3 different banana farms. I learned a lot about how they're grown. I learned that banana plants are really tall. So there's me for scale, I'm pretty tall. Banana plants are usually 10 to 16 feet tall. And it was really amazing to see all these different types growing and to realize that there is so much diversity out there besides just the Cavendish. I saw all different kinds of colors of bananas. I saw red ones and green ones and blue ones. The blue ones are called ice cream because they are said to taste like vanilla. And there are also ones with cool leaf patterns. There's ones with like black and green striped leaves. They just look like that normally. I think it's pretty cool. And Same with like white and green striped leaves. And it was just really cool to see all these plants. And the way I actually ended up going there in the first place was I found an Airbnb listing for a cottage that was on a banana farm. And I said to myself, oh wow, I really want to go there. So I did. And as you can see, the cottage was very banana themed. There's like a banana cutouts on the porch. There's a banana by the roof. And if you look at the rooms, you can see that the inside was totally, everything was bananas, like the pillows. There's banana leaf print curtains in the living room. It was really cool. And even down to all the little details, there were bananas everywhere. There's like the house number sign, this teapot, the woodworking, even the shampoo and conditioner were banana scented. And the owner of the Airbnb actually left a plate with 6 different types of bananas for my arrival. So I tried bits of all of them, and it was interesting. They were like really sweet. Some of them were kind of orangey or pineapple-y. My favorite one was this one called Nama, which kind of tasted like cotton candy. And when I talked to farmers, they actually said that it would be devastating if TR4 were to spread to Hawaii. It turns out that in addition to killing the Cavendish, it can also kill a lot of local varieties. So I learned that while monoculture is a problem, no matter what, there are still a ton of different varieties that would be just devastated by this disease. Also, farmers were pretty lucky back in the 1950s when the Cavendish was around to replace the Gros Michel. It just so happened that it was resistant to TR1, and they were able to basically swap one out for the other. But this time there is no such banana that can just come in and be a replacement for that. So there are some researchers out there who are trying to solve this problem through other ways. And I'm going to talk about one of them, James Dale, who is based in Australia, and he has seen the effects of TR4 firsthand. His team has created a genetically modified banana. They actually took a gene, well, they took several genes, but the one that they're focusing on now is the gene from a wild banana. And they were able to put that into the Cavendish genome and essentially make it resistant to TR4. Here you can see the controls on the left. This is from one of their papers. The controls on the left were infected by the fungus, but the ones with the genes put in them are fine. You can see this is how the plant should look normally. It's just uniformly pale. So there are a couple drawbacks, though, to this. One is that it's expensive to produce. Right now it's just grown in a lab. Well, technically grown in a field, but it's from a lab. And another is that they are GMOs, and right now not everyone supports GMOs. So one other thing that they're trying to come up with would be, instead of a genetically modified banana, would be a gene-edited banana. And that would be different because instead of taking a gene from something else and putting it in the Cavendish, they would really just try to go in and edit the Cavendish's genome and make it resistant. So, and if they did that, it wouldn't have to be labeled in supermarkets like GMOs are. But they're not sure that this is a feasible solution, and so they're still working on it. It's also possible that somehow through conventional breeding, it is tough to do, but it is possible that somehow someone could generate a TR4 resistant type. So that might be an option too. It's also worth mentioning that papayas in Hawaii are actually mainly GMO, and they have been for about 20 years. So basically, the same thing kind of happened where there was this disease that came in and started attacking papayas, and scientists came up with a GMO version that was resistant. One of the farmers I talked to kind of compared it to a vaccine. It just made papayas resistant to this disease, and now 75% of Hawaii's papaya farmland is used to grow GMO papayas. Another important thing to note is that people tend to accept GMOs if there is no other alternative. Americans eat 28 pounds of bananas per person per year, which may seem like a lot until you compare it to places like Uganda, where people grow bananas to eat and really to survive. They eat over 550 pounds of bananas per person per year in Uganda. And recently, their bananas were being attacked by like a bacterial wilt. And so the government recently passed a law to allow farmers to try growing GMO bananas that were developed by Ugandan scientists. And farmers were very in support of this. Before the law was passed, they were like, where are these bananas? We want to try growing them. So it really depends on what the situation is in terms of GMO acceptance. So this demand for mass-produced bananas, it's led to this monoculture, and it's led to this expectation that we should have bananas. And there is a lot being done to try to solve this problem, and we know it's not like the sensational headlines that we see where they say bananas will disappear forever. We know that's not true. But we may have to rethink our expectations. Bananas really are this tropical fruit that people just came in and got from Latin American countries. And after we do come up with a solution for tropical race 4, James Dale said that there will probably be some other kind of disease, maybe a tropical race 5 someday. So we don't have an answer right now. But I do know that at least we should appreciate the bananas that we can buy right now. And think about how amazing it is that bananas were able to become so widespread and so widely available to us. Because the Cavendish as we know it may not be here forever. Thank you.
I'm wondering if the GMO-modified Australian bananas have the ability to reproduce.
They, not sexually, so they basically reproduce in the same way that most banana plants reproduce, and it's just like little offshoots come up, and the farmers can replant them. So it's still the same thing where they're all basically clones of each other.
And then can you also say something about the polyculture of Hawaiian bananas and how, and if that has been tried in other places to get away from the monoculture?
Right, so there are so many different types of bananas grown in Hawaii. I talked to, or actually, yeah, one of the banana farmers that I talked to and that I went to see his farm, he was growing over 100 different types. And so there's hundreds of varieties grown there. But the thing is, like I said, a lot of them would still be susceptible to TR4. So in terms of, it might be good if like some disease came up that only attacked some of them, like maybe there would be a variety that is resistant, or some varieties that are resistant that could kind of take over. But for TR4 especially, it seems like it's pretty devastating to almost everything.
Hi, Emily. That was an interesting topic. Thank you so much. I had two questions, and the one is, are plantains being affected? Because I really like plantain chips.
Plantains, yes, they are. Yeah, plantains are actually, I learned a lot about them. They're also bananas, but not all bananas are plantains. And yeah, they would also be affected. So, yeah, basically it's just susceptible to those two.
I have to buy up and go along. I had a question of when you mentioned monoculture, it seems like there's this theme of narrowing of choices of what's being brought to the marketplace for consumption. So you were speaking about bananas, but I thought about apples, peaches, tomatoes, pineapples.
Yeah.
There's something more to this monoculture concept, and I'm just curious, who makes these decisions around monoculture? Is it the agricultural companies or the farming industries?
Yeah, so especially in the banana industry, it really was companies like, so actually the Boston Fruit Company, which became the United Fruit Company, which became Chiquita, they were basically like the company that, and this happens with other, in tomatoes and other crops too, basically companies that are in charge that become these like kind of conglomerates of all these other smaller banana companies, they basically make those decisions, and a lot of it is about business and about having the most like cost-effective thing, and also just in starting from like the late 1800s, the demand for bananas just really grew. So part of it is demand, part of it is that they wanted to come up with this banana that would, or this plant that would like grow a lot of bananas, and the bananas that it does grow are really sturdy, and they hold up to mass transport really well. But yeah, a lot of it is just because of business.
How long did it take to go from the ancient banana to the Cavendish, or earlier, the one earlier, the bigger version, the seedless? I mean, there's such a difference. How long did it take to evolve, to cultivate that? Yeah.
A really, really long time. So we think that bananas started to be cultivated around 10,000 years ago. And I know that Cavendish has been growing for probably several thousand years. And it essentially took thousands of years to get from the wild banana to the kind that we have now. And that's also why, James Dale has that gene from a wild banana. That's also why we can't just take that wild banana and with the resistant gene and try to transform it into a supermarket banana, because it would take so long to do that.
I realize I could have asked you this over the year, but it just occurred to me. I know that for apples, there is a place in upstate New York where they have all of the gene lines, shout out to upstate New York, set aside in safe spaces so that if anything like this happens to apples, they have all of these ancient lineages that they can pull from. Is there anywhere that some of these lines that are existing in Hawaii right now are protected?
In Hawaii, I'm not too sure about that. Basically, one of the farmers that I went to go see, the one who was growing 100 varieties, he kind of was trying himself to come up with this banana library. Like, he was essentially trying to preserve rare varieties. Worldwide, I think in places like Taiwan and the Philippines, there's a lot of different varieties there, and I'm pretty sure some of the universities there have some kind of like banana library.
Sort of a follow-up to Marcia's question. Where was the ancestral heartland? Where was the original wild banana?
The original wild banana, it was we think it was in Asia. I want to say like in China.
So, did wild bananas ever get to Latin America, or is the Latin American banana industry entirely an introduced one?
No, there are also wild bananas. So in places like in Hawaii, there's wild bananas. In Latin America, there's wild bananas. Basically, on that map I showed you of banana-producing countries, a lot of wild bananas also grow. And sometimes they grow on the same plantations where like Cavendish grow. Actually, the wild banana was that James Dale was using, it was actually found on a plantation that had been devastated by Fusarium that grew Cavendish bananas. Basically, the whole plantation was devastated, and they found this one wild banana that was just kind of growing all by itself in the field. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Minding the Empathy Gap with Diego Arenas as your presenter.
Okay, cool. Okie dokie. Good. So I'd like to begin my presentation with a pretty obvious fact. There's a lot of conflict in the world, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the war in South Sudan, to tensions about the US-Mexico border. Clearly, there is no shortage of examples in which people fail to see eye to eye. So for my thesis, I wanted to see how neuroscience and social psychology are looking into polarization and how those insights are basically informing how we can cultivate empathy for the other side. Most of us would think, or do think of empathy as this innate human ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. But as it turns out, seeing the world from another point of view, another person's perspective, actually requires a lot of things to happen in your head. So say, for example, you are going to brunch with a friend. You do this every weekend, but on this particular Sunday, your friend seems a little bit off. You sense that they're distant and quiet, and then when you ask them what happened, or if anything is wrong, they tell you that they lost their job. They immediately start to cry, and in that moment, you yourself start to tear up. Seeing your friend anxious and upset makes you anxious and upset. And then you might remember a time that you yourself lost a job, and that just makes things even worse. So that's the problem with studying empathy in the brain, is that, So you might consider this all one response, this empathic response to a certain situation, but the fact is that there's a lot of things going on in your head, and that's the problem with studying empathy in the brain. Each one of these psychological states that you take on actually requires different mental functions. So as a result, cognitive scientists are parsing out the nuances of empathy, and some of them are looking specifically into how we process other people's pain. So one study that I looked at for my thesis was this one, in which scientists put people in an MRI scanner, and they present them pictures like this, pretty innocuous, nothing too crazy about them, people opening doors, their hands and feet just kind of in plain view, and someone cutting up vegetables. And when they looked at this, nothing in their brains really showed up. There was nothing really out of the ordinary. But then the scientists showed them pictures more like this, which you see it's a lot more painful situations. This person is clearly going to cut themselves cutting that zucchini. And some of them are obviously a little bit more relatable than others. I don't know anyone, or I personally have never jammed my foot in a car door like that. But anyways, compared to people who looked at the pictures on the right, the ones that are harmless, the brains of the people who looked at the painful images, the ones on the left, their brains looked a little bit more like this. And this is an image from, or a figure from the paper that I was talking about. So you can see that there are two main structures in the brain that lit up: the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the ACC, and the insula. So I don't have a pointer, but the ACC is kind of more central in the brain, and then the insulas are more in the periphery. And this shows just like a profile view of that. That graph is just showing that so a positive correlation between the change in the ACC activity and pain subjective index. So basically, the more the ACC lit up, the more the subjects reported higher levels of pain. Right. So what do these two structures do, the ACC and the insula again? Well, typically they process our own sensations of pain. So for example, say you stub your toe, and these two structures are the ones that are responsible for processing that pain, and they either prepare a response to either avoid it or end it. So if you stub your toe, it's the two things that kind of process the initial sensation of pain and send you reeling on your good foot while you're rubbing your bad one with your hands. And it's the fact that these two regions lit up, the fact that these two regions that process our own pain lighting up indicates that when the people in the scanners were looking at other people's pain, it indicates that maybe we hope to end other people's pain as much as we wish to avoid it for ourselves. And what I found was even more interesting is the way that you view a person's pain can change the way it imprints in the brain. So to understand this a little bit better, I talked to Professor Klaus Lamb at the University of Vienna, and he described how imagining yourself going through someone else's hardship is not the same as focusing on on how they're feeling as they're experiencing the pain themselves. So Professor Lamb actually repeated the experiment, the hands and feet, the painful one that I showed previously, but he added his own twist. He asked one set of participants to imagine themselves as the person in the picture going through the pain, and then asked another subset of participants to imagine how the person in the picture was feeling, so a more distant relation to the person in the picture. And not surprisingly, those who imagined themselves going through the pain reported higher levels of stress. And now, the self-other distinction is nuanced, but it matters because directly mirroring someone else's anguish can lead to emotional burnout that actually decreases the likelihood of prosocial behavior. So Lamb and others advocate for a more effective form of empathy, one that might be a little bit more distant, but doesn't lead to this overwhelming emotional fatigue that actually decreases the likelihood of people helping other people out. And the regions in the brain that actually allow for this distinction between the self and the other are still under investigation, but the hope is, so although neuroscience has gone far distance and made huge strides in understanding pain in the brain, it's still kind of in its infancy. So the hope is that future MRI studies will inform the people who are actually trying to resolve real-world conflicts. And one of these people is Andrew Hanauer. So Andrew Hanauer is the director of the One America movement. It is a nonprofit bridge-building organization that was founded after the 2016 presidential election. So One America is dedicated to combating polarization of many types throughout the country. And when I reached out to Hanauer, he was working to bring together a group of Latter-day Saints, previously known as Mormons, and Jewish people in a community just outside of Salt Lake City. The two groups weren't necessarily in direct conflict, but the leaders in both religious communities thought that it would be, or they wanted to foster understanding, given that Jewish people are a very small minority in Utah. I think they make up about 0.2% of the population, while LDS members make up 60% or so. So I was curious to see what this kind of looked like in real life, what this kind of strategies people were taking. So I flew out to Utah in January as well, definitely not as warm as Hawaii. And what you're seeing here in this picture is the inside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in South Jordan, Utah. And this is where most of the event took place. And just to kind of set the scene, I would like to read a little passage from my thesis, if I can get to it. On that cold January night in Utah, Hanauer brought ideas from social science to bear on the conversations between LDS members and Jews. Down the hall from the chapel, in the recreational space of the church, a darkened scoreboard hangs on the walls as the attendees huddle around tables placed across the basketball court. In small groups, the participants discuss their impressions and experiences with the other faith. Their chatter fills the high ceilings of this basketball-turned safe space until Hanauer calls for everyone's attention. He introduces what he believes is part of the reason the country is so divided, the idea of metaperceptions. Metaperceptions are what I think the other side thinks about me. So for instance, what do Republicans think about Democrats think of Republicans, he says. As it turns out, when we believe the other side doesn't like us, we don't like them back. And even if our initial impression is wrong, it creates a feedback cycle that makes it worse and worse. Hanauer opens the floor for participants to air their concerns with metaperceptions in their own lives. One woman describes her resigned frustration from being called an immigrant sewer rat in Texas before she moved to Utah. I should probably say something to them, but I don't, she says. I think it comes back to education in most instances, because I don't understand where they're coming from. So despite the feel-good sentiments and the well-intentions of Hanauer and One America, it's a little bit hard to assess how effective these strategies are on people that are already open-minded enough and willing to go to events like this. As it turns out, and not surprisingly, for individuals who are more stubborn in their ways, eliciting empathy can be a much more difficult task. So metaperceptions, speaking of which, for example, don't always work. If you think about it, when a person is thinking about how their rival perceives them, they might realize that they're not entirely blameless in the conflict, and this creates some sort of cognitive dissonance that they just settle by doubling down. So they end up just standing more firmly behind their original beliefs. Nevertheless, some social psychologists have found other ways to reduce some of the most intractable conflicts in the world. Boaz Hamiri, this guy right here, is a social cognitive scientist in the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been designing and implementing interventions for regions involved in long-standing conflicts, including one in his home country of Israel. So when I spoke to him, he told me about an intervention that he based on this idea of paradoxical thinking. And paradoxical thinking is this practice of exaggerating an idea almost to the point of absurdity. So for the Jewish Israelis, this meant telling them that they needed the conflict to persist in order to feel positively about themselves. And this was just crazy enough to work. Several months after the intervention, during the 2013 Israeli general elections, the participants who were exposed to paradoxical thinking were reported to be more inclined to vote for parties that advocated for more peaceful resolutions. But as we know, conflict isn't something that's isolated to just distant countries and other parts of the world. New conflicts can arise pretty much any day about anything. And I spoke to Dr. Jay Van Babel about this. He is the director of the Social Perception and Evaluation Lab at the New York University, so NYU. And he confirmed how inflammatory language and social media creates this echo chamber that just reinforces our beliefs and can skew the way we see reality and we see other people. So for a decade, Van Babel has been complementing his observations of the human behavior with fMRI studies. And he described fMRI as this way of looking under the hood of a car. And he described it this way. Or he likened MRI to looking under the hood of a car. So if your car is broken, you don't know if the starter is not working, or the spark plug, or the fan belt. You just take it into the mechanic, they lift up the hood and see what part is broken. It's the same when it comes to understanding human psychology and behavior. So after 9 months of researching and writing about empathy, I wholeheartedly agree with this sentiment. I think that if we're going to reach peaceful resolutions for the most hardened conflicts in the world, it'll definitely come from a collaboration between neuroscience, fMRI stuff, and increasingly sophisticated social psychology. And I just want to thank everyone, Tom for being such a great advisor, our class. I don't have baby pictures, but I have friends. And obviously Shannon and my sources. And yeah, thank you. Questions.
I'm so glad to hear your presentation now, because I missed it the other day.
Yeah.
I'm curious if in any of your research you came across some of the stuff that they're looking into with like MDMA and psychedelic mushrooms as far as increasing empathy. If there's been like kind of
like microdosing and stuff like that?
Yeah, I feel like I've read a little bit about how people think that those experiences can increase empathy, but I wasn't sure if there has been any like neuroscience about it.
No, I didn't look into it for this particular thing, just because the scope of empathy is so big. Like I said, it's really hard to define. So there's so many different approaches and there's so many components to the idea of empathy that, yeah, but that is interesting. Thank you. Question.
Thanks, Diego. Appreciate it. Very nice presentation. The first thought that comes to mind is that I think Star Trek has taught us that only betazoids can master empathy. And so I had a question around that. Had a question around ACC. Is that something that can be controlled? For example, if a subject was anesthetized, would the brain areas still light up?
You mean if
they were subject to pain while being treated for pain at the same time, would the brain still trigger, or would it be blocked?
Yeah, so the thing with pain is that a lot of the time, at least for your own pain, it's not so much that it doesn't turn off the pain, it just like lowers your like people are aware that they're feeling pain. It's just that they care less that they're going through it. And I don't know if that affects directly to the cingulate cortex. It's just more, I think that probably affects more of like the sensory cortex. So like the initial sensation of pain where it tells you where it's coming from in the body. This is more of like your internal mechanism to tell you like, stop doing what you're doing so you avoid the pain. So it's a little bit more higher level thinking when it comes to that.
Had another follow-up question. This 3-year study, did you come to a conclusion whether empathy was more of an emotion versus a neurofunction? Because you did mention how people are hardwired and there's core thoughts and a resistance to change how they react to conflicts.
So you're saying if it's,
in your study, did you come to a conclusion or a thought that empathy was more neuro-based or behavioral-based?
so that's the tricky part to like parse out, because I think that we're still trying to bridge the divide from understanding pain in the brain and trying to apply it to real world resolutions. So obviously every emotion and every behavior can be reflected in the brain. So I think it's both. It's a matter of understanding what connects to what in the brain, so it leads to a certain behavior. But right now, I think people are just attacking mostly what they can do in terms of changing behavior. Right now, like I said, the MRI stuff is still kind of in its infancy. It's not something you can directly apply. But yeah.
Was there anything in the studies related to pseudo-bulbar effect where people just react to something extreme? Like, for example, they say a child being harmed or being discussed, and they become very emotional. Was there anything in studies related to that, like as a condition of empathy, like a physical condition of empathy?
You mean like a visceral reaction to it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I read a lot about was that this is like another component that makes it really tricky to define empathy. Is that this is like another mental state that corresponds to another mental function. So it's hard to, like I said, cover the entire field of empathy, but that is an interesting question, because it is like, do we define that as empathy, and do we also define mirroring someone's posture, like when they're slouched over, is that also empathy? So there's so many different components that it's hard to, I guess you kind of have to personally pick, the scientists that I spoke to pick what they want to look into specifically in empathy. So I guess, yeah.
I'm very fascinated by, animals like bees or birds that move as one body.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there were animal studies done. It a little bit builds on some of the things you were asking in your research.
So I didn't look too much at animal studies. So Professor Klaus Lamb, this guy, he's actually doing some empathy research on dogs and ravens, because they have that like pack mentality, specifically ravens. So I was focusing a little bit more on humans, but it is an interesting field to see how it correlates with humans, especially since our brains are so different. And yeah.
Thanks. You talked a little bit about conflicts in first world countries, like the story about the 2 religious groups in Utah, and then also about conflicts in developing countries, like in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And those seem like very different situations to me, because in one, probably most of the people involved have everything they need to be secure in their survival, whereas in the other, people definitely might not. So I was just wondering how that comes into the research, and if researchers have to alter their strategies a bit to account for that.
Yeah, I think they definitely do. I think you have to, that's also kind of an issue where they have to, like for example, the paradoxical thinking approach, I don't think would work for any sort of conflict resolution. I think it depends a lot on what you're dealing with. But the idea for studying empathy is not so much the current state of the conflict that's happening. It's the idea of othering other people. So in both scenarios, you're kind of saying that the people that aren't like you are it can take a very like inhuman perspective, kind of like completely denying their humanity. In both situations, like even here where we're talking about like immigration reform, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's a lot about just denying someone their humanity, and that's, I think, what bridges this idea of studying conflict in a more general sense. But obviously there's a lot of factors that go into how people perceive each other and like what the actual nuanced situation is. But yeah.
For these depolarization programs like One America, do you have a sense of how they're measuring efficacy, and among these programs, what percentage might be evidence-based versus not?
Yeah, so they say that they're, and I forgot to mention this, they do say that they base most of their strategies on neuroscience, so they have people who they consult with who tell them kind of, like the idea of meta-perceptions is obviously one that's been kind of tried and hopefully true in most cases, but yeah, I don't think they're tracking, like I said, it's kind of hard to see how each one of these works out because they are dealing with very different conflicts. So like this one was talking about religion, but they also deal with like opioid use and like homelessness in different communities. So it's hard to like see how effective it is because everything is so different. And I don't know if they keep some sort of like database about, or how they quantify it. It is a good question. Takers? Oh.
Actually, let's do one over here, and then I'll bring it back. Hi. One facet of all of these sort of situations you bring up, these conflicts, but thinking about people experiencing homelessness and interactions there. It seems like part of the point of othering and dehumanizing is to exert power over that person and withhold from them, exploit them in some way. And so I wonder, is the idea with sort of thinking about empathy as like enhancing empathy as a way out? How does that come into conflict with the fact that there is a power relation that people are trying to exploit, and that sort of underlies the lack of empathy in the first place?
Right. So I think that ties back to a little bit to the original question or someone else's question about how you deal with these kind of conflicts. Like I said, it's kind of, so my approach to studying this was to try to take a more objective look at empathy and see how, and not try to like understand the backgrounds of the conflicts that were occurring. I wanted to see what we could do to resolve them, if there was something that tied them all together. And this idea of like imposing power, I think definitely, it depends on the conflict, obviously, but it is a struggle for power, but I don't think it's something that ties directly, or none of the studies that I saw were studying what you were talking about, like this component, and again, of empathy, where it just complicates things even more. It was more of like just trying to see eye to eye, I guess. Yeah.
Quick question, but did you look into VR and AR at all and its role in empathy increasing?
No, I didn't. But I mean, like I said, there's so many strategies like the microdosing, and it's just we only have so much time. But it is something I was very interested in. And I did see some primary literature on that, but I didn't include it in here.
Thank you very much, Diego. And now, for the fourth and last presentation in our morning session, we have an intriguingly titled presentation called The Living Library from Devi Lockwood, who, okay, so there will be a momentary break.
Yeah, if you go, it's go left and then left again. He's good, so thank you.
Yep. But they started preparing most of it yesterday, and should I be your team in your okay?
Yeah. Yes. Have you taken your stuff? Yeah, great job.
I'm going to send out
So are you going to get
Yeah, I'm first.
Oh, you're first up.
Good. Interesting topic. How did you choose that topic?
I don't really know. It was sort of a random series of events. I changed my idea a number of times, and then I saw an article that I was interesting about assistive technology that someone was trying to create, talked to the developer, and then kind of sent me down a route of researching it further.
Just you're curious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
program is for you.
Great. Yeah. I mean, now it's over. But yeah, it's
It's
really
been 1 year, but you have an internship, don't you? Right.
Yeah.
What's your internship? And is your internship on the theme of your presentation?
No.
Could be on anything.
Anything. I am going to work within an environmental reporting desk in Philadelphia at the local radio station.
Radio station?
Yeah.
Are you from Philadelphia?
I'm not. Never, but
So how did that job come about?
it actually came about. One of the night fellows used to work at this station, and she connected me with the science reporters there. And,
Do you
yeah,
have a relationship? Does this program have a relationship with the Night Fellows program?
very loosely. The head of the night fellows program, Deborah Blum, she teaches one of our classes, and they're basically she's not here at the moment, but they're
Her
basically
name is Deborah Blum.
yeah, and she's a investigative journalist. She's worked at a million newspapers. It's been around for a long time. Very accomplished. But yeah, they're sort of dark.
New as the director. I think she.
Like a couple years.
Just 1 year.
Yeah.
She's maybe been around.
Do you work at MIT or?
I teach here. Yeah, Devi's in my class.
Oh, okay.
I've been a go girl.
You teach the climate change lab class? Cool.
Yeah, we're good.
So everyone, can we resume our seats? And again, The Living Library, thesis by Devi Lockwood.
Great. So hi, my name is Devi, and I spent 3 weeks this January in Ucayali, Peru. Ucayali is a region in eastern Peru that's home to about 500,000 people. The Ucayali River, which is a tributary to the Amazon that flows from the south to the north, runs through this region. And there's one large city called Pucallpa and a constellation of smaller towns that dot the river's banks. The majority of the floodplains of Ucayali are, for right now, still forested, but this region is very vulnerable to land use change. And the river is kind of a broad, brown source of water where there's suspended sediment, and it's a highway not only for people and bananas, but for the cut trunks of trees, some of which are cut illegally, many are poached, and kind of lashed together on rafts and floated downstream to sawmills. Deforestation is a huge issue in this part of the Amazon. About 1,100 square miles of Peru's forests are cut each year. So for scale, that's about one Massachusetts every 9 years. And the principal activities that put this area of the Amazon at risk are slash and burn agriculture, mining, and illicit crops. But there's also a cultural risk that comes along hand in hand with this loss of plant life. So that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. This is what it looks like flying in or out of the area. You can see kind of patches of the forest, the darker parts that are punctuated by lighter patches of land that's been cut. And you can see the kind of ribbon of the Ucayali River out there on the horizon. And this is what it looks like flying in or out of Pucallpa, city of about 300,000 people. And this is the Ucayali River kind of from eye height with a peke, which is one of these kind of motorized boats with a long tail of the motor coming off the back that carry cut logs, and you can kind of hear them humming along the river all times of day and night.
So as I mentioned, there's a lot of smaller towns that are nearby the city. Getting from Pucallpa to the town that I wrote my thesis about, Paoyan, involves a boat trip on a boat, something like this. There's two options: the fast boat for about $20 that takes 3 hours, or a slower boat that takes 5 hours and is much cheaper at $9. The boat is really loud. It's this vibrating hull with the motor as its node, and there's cumbia played on top of that. And these boats are filled with either people as passengers or bananas. Shout out to Emily M. And there's also lots of smaller channels, again, just to give a sense of place, that flood often, but you can travel on these little tiny boats to get from place to place. At the time of year when I went, the floods were late, so I was unable to get to Paoyan directly, but I was able to visit a smaller town, Santa Clara, that is kind of analogous in population. So, the culture of these villages is Shipibo Conibo, which is an indigenous group in the Peruvian Amazon. Shipibo people have been living in the Ucayali region for thousands of years. They speak Shipibo, which is a language in the Panoan language family, though most people who are under 70 years old also speak Spanish. Shipibo culture is distinctive for its connection to traditional plant medicine. Knowledge comes from the plants directly. And shamans apprentice themselves to a plant in order to be able to heal members of their community and themselves. If you cut down the trees, the Shipibo people who call Ucayali their home are threatened as well. To kill the plant world is to kill the Shipibo spirit world. And among the younger generation in Paoyan, there is less and less of a connection to this plant world over time. I met a leader in the town that I was able to visit named Victor Sanchez, who credits the current education system with a disconnect from medicinal plants. Because they study at school, primary and nursery school, some people know about plants, but not many, he told me. They don't know about our medicines, and things have changed. This change has kind of linked to the influence of other countries, which is what he said. In the 1950s, a Spanish language education system was introduced in Ucayali, which created a gulf between the youth, who are educated mostly in Spanish, and the elders in the community who spoke only Shipibo. Valles learned about medicinal plants from his grandparents. And he told me that his kind of plant knowledge can be used to heal fevers, diarrhea, and vomiting. So kind of the second main actor in this story is Alianza Arcana, which is an NGO based in the city of Pucallpa, Peru. They're founded in 2011. This is their back porch where I did most of my interviews. The central belief that kind of they operate under is that thriving people make a thriving rainforest, and vice versa. So what happened was that 2 years ago, the elected leader, or jefe of Paoyan, named Humberto Rojas, wanted to confront a problem. He noticed that there were 3 bad things happening to his community. First, the weather was getting worse. Unpredictable flooding washed away crops, which was punctuated by periods of drought. In other words, the climate was changing. Economic opportunities beyond subsistence farming and crafts were also slim, and some people in Paoyan had turned to logging to earn a living, which took them away from their community for extended periods of time. While logging brought in some money, it resulted in the destruction of the forest elsewhere. So Humberto asked for Alianza to lead a climate change workshop in his community of 2,000 people. It was held inside the local, which is this kind of bluish-green community hall that's filled with natural light that comes in through the slatted windows, and it's on an elevated platform to protect it from when the floods come. And a mixed group of teenagers and adults and elders all came together over a lunch of rice and beans and fried plantains to discuss this trio of issues. They drew a map to organize their thoughts. Community members called out issues that they had, and then they plotted each of these topics to a specific place on the map. And a lot of those concerns were environmental, like the bank is eroding and there's flooding and our lakes are drying up. A second cluster of concerns were about medicine, that we need more medicines for our health post. So, the key solution that emerged out of all of this conversation was to try to create a botanical preserve, a place where existing medicinal plants could be cataloged, something like books in a library, protected for future generations, and used as educational material for youth in the community. Eventually, they hoped this would also attract ecotourism from the outside.
And one of the elders, Segundo Franco, jumped up to his feet and said that if he could see this happen before he died, he would die happy, just fall over dead, which was kind of fantastic and a vote of confidence. So a committee was formed. There are 8 people in it so far, and what they've done is set aside 5 hectares, which is 5 football fields of land. That's about a 15-minute boat ride from their community, and they've divided that land into sub-parcels and are going through to catalog every medicinal plant that's in there, again, like books in a library. I'll show you guys just the first little bit of this film to give you, again, a sense of place. Fingers crossed that it works.
Vivimos aproximadamente, Pauya, 2.000 habitantes, donde los hombres pescan y construyen su casa, y las mujeres siembran y también hacen su artesanía, donde los niños estudian y practican el deporte. Somos shipibos conivos y hablamos en shipibo, también en español.
Para nosotros el bosque es más importante, de ahí sacamos las comidas, las casas, la medicina. Cuando era yo niñita, mi abuelita me enseñaba, con las plantas me curaba. Cuando ya tenía un dolor fuerte en mi estómago, cuando tenía un corte, con las plantas me curaba. Ahora yo me preocupo los niños y los jóvenes olvidando las medicinas.
Nuestros jóvenes hoy en día no tienen nada de conocimiento, el conocimiento ancestral de nuestros antepasados.
So, I'm going to give you guys just a whirlwind tour of 3 of the plants that are just a small sample of the 400 plus that have been cataloged so far. This is copaiba in Spanish, which the essential oil can be a laxative, diuretic, stimulant, can be also used to treat inflammation and a whole other large number of things. We have ishanga in Spanish, which is again diuretic, laxative. The juice of the leaves can be used against conjunctivitis. It's also a bactericide and an anti-inflammatory medicine. Or danderana, which the leaves can be used to alleviate sunburns, trunk cortex for malaria, and an infusion of the cortex for diarrhea. As you can see, there's just a whole ton of knowledge that's contained within these plants and within the people who are kind of collecting and cataloging this. So it's an effort to make a trilingual resource. It's all in a spreadsheet right now, and a work in progress. A brief lesson in Shipibo. So Nonrao are our medicines, plant medicines, and Nahuanrao are pills, Western medication. But I think what's important to note here is that nearly 1 in 4 Western pharmaceuticals come from rainforest plants right now. And the National Cancer Institute estimates that around 70% of anti-cancer plants identified so far come from the rainforest. So for example, fingers crossed I pronounced this correctly, vincristine and vinblastine is a drug that originated from the Madagascar periwinkle, and it's now widely used to treat lymphoma. Or Taxol, which is derived from the bark of the North American yew tree, is a common treatment for ovarian and breast cancer. So there's just a massive amount of knowledge that is in the plant world. And so the community hopes that revitalizing this knowledge form will help heal the village and shore up the supplies that they have at their local health post, but also attract income from the outside. So there's some conversation within the community right now floating about how can we maybe attract pharmaceutical companies? Is that something that we even want? One volunteer worker for the NGO, Alianza Arcana, talked to me and he said that these ideas are still floating in the air and the land is not yet legally protected, but they're working on that too. So it's sort of the very beginning. They're in the first 2 years of this project and they're making kind of tough decisions about who this is going to benefit and what their core values are. The community has also started to lead workshops where youth who have never been among these trees before come to learn about the medicinal properties of the plants that surround their community and are such a large part of their culture. Another cool thing I wanted to point out, and a bit of science to understand why this region is so ecologically sensitive and why it matters for the global climate system, is that we can think about aerial rivers. So
Evapotranspiration is the movement of moisture from the forest-shaded soil and also through kind of the foliage itself that evaporates into the atmosphere. And this is a key driver of rainfall. So moisture travels through the atmosphere in something called aerial rivers, and deforestation cuts the supply of that evapotranspirated water to the river, which disrupts the amount of rainfall that's going to happen downwind. So if you cut the trees in Ucayali, Peru, the rainfall reduces not just locally, but also further down the aerial river in Brazil, Colombia, other parts of the Amazon. So again, it's an ecologically sensitive area, an area of importance for climate change both regionally and globally, and land use change here matters. So I think this is kind of an innovative, super small scale, again, 5 football fields, but local example of what one indigenous community, is trying to do to protect their land and protect their culture. And on the kind of economic question mark side of things, the who will come, who are these eco-tourists going to be? So right now there's been about 50 dieteros who come from the outside. That means just dieters in Spanish, so people who come to diet on a plant, to communicate with a plant directly, to ingest that plant, and to have a spiritual connection with it. So it's kind of a like hippie, new agey type thing, but it's driving income into the community. And then again, cultural revival. So as I mentioned, the educational arm of the Living Library is really just getting started. But back in September of last year, Alianza Arcana led a group for Shipibo youth in Payan to visit Farmacia for the first time. And many young people see plant medicines as something that old people do, but bringing them into the plants. And after seeing some of these for the first time, one of the younger girls, Kelly Cassandra, said, "Now I feel like I know what my mom was talking about." And so if young people never experience a plant, how are they going to connect with it, right? And this project is all about fostering that connection, plant to person, person to plant. And how can you value what you don't know? It's the big question. So, photos by these wonderful humans. And thank you.
So you mentioned that children under the age of 7 typically speak Spanish, and that's just a really specific age, and I was wondering if anything happened.
Yeah, I might have misspoke. I meant to say 70.
Never mind.
Yeah, so that's because around the 1950s is when a Spanish language education system was introduced in the community. So if you get people who are older than 70, they typically speak only Shipibo, and then people younger than that are bilingual.
Okay. That's way less mysterious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could you say something more about the education system that the communities you visited had?
Yeah, so it's often, I mean, this is a little bit outside of the realm of what I know because school wasn't in session when I was there, so I wasn't able to witness any of this firsthand. But the sense I get is that compared with the time earlier when language instruction wasn't happening in Spanish, kids spent a lot more time outside and in the trees. And through spending time directly with kind of elders in their community who had the knowledge of the plants, they were able to gain that through experience. And the sense I get, and again, I'm a little bit out of my water right now, but would be that an education system in Spanish is kind of reinforcing national values and what it means to be Peruvian rather than what it means to be indigenous and Shipibo. And so I think this is kind of a pushback to that. But among the older residents of these communities who I interviewed, they were noting that the youth are looking more outwards rather than looking inwards. So I think it's an education system that values knowledge coming from the outside rather than knowledge coming from within, and that's sort of the unique position that the community is in now, kind of facing questions about okay, how can we take advantage of this to benefit our youth, and what does that look like? So it's.
How Asian people themselves? What is their population?
I think it's about 25 or 35,000. Again, I have to double check. But it's listed as an endangered language, but not, like there's a level more than that, that it could be worse. So I think the culture seems really strong. While I was there, there was an indigenous soccer tournament happening. So it was rainy season, so not a lot of people were going out to the communities, but a lot of people came to the city. And so villages were competing against one another, both men's and women's teams. I think the women's competition started just like 2 or 3 years ago. It was amazing to see in terms of just an example of cultural revival, but also taking something like a sport that was introduced by missionaries and completely claiming it as their own. And I've never seen a like more well-attended soccer match in my life. It was like 90 million degrees. Everyone's like sitting under these little tiny shaded areas and cheering on their villages, right? So it was kind of a beautiful example. And for me, that just showed, again, I'm like an outsider, so what do I know? But for me, that just showed the strength of indigenous culture in the area and how core it is to this part of the Amazon.
Oh, hi. I had a couple questions. You mentioned that these people have a legacy of plants and healing that they want to preserve. And you mentioned that how can we value what we don't know? So there was like a real learning experience for you to see what these people have to offer. So the question I had is, can they in some way patent protect the intellectual property that they have? That would create value for them if they could have some ownership. And it seems like what they're doing is unique with the land and trying to create this space. If it's unique to them, maybe they should try to get some kind of protection for that. And I was curious whether, is there anybody helping them with the preservation, or are they kind of going it alone? Do we need to put Ken Burns on a plane and send them down there?
So for the second question first, I know they're actively looking for funds. There's a crowdfunding campaign going on, I think, on Global Giving right now. And a lot of people, when I was doing interviews, they're like, can you help us get money for this? And I'm like, journalistic integrity. But at the same time, yeah, I think they're actively looking for more support and hoping to attract scientists in the future too. It's mostly the volunteers who are doing the cataloging, kind of going out with a Shipibo guide. And one of the volunteers was telling me a story about how just the mosquitoes are so intense that they've like got their rain jackets zipped up all the way to their eyes, even though it's super duper hot and humid, and still getting bitten because they attack new people the worst. But to answer your question about patenting, I think that's a fantastic one. I am not a lawyer, so I don't know the ins and outs of that. I do remember, and I don't remember if it was in Peru or elsewhere, but there was conversations about patenting indigenous patterns, because the sewing that I showed in one of the slides is something that's culturally unique. It's specific. And one thing I didn't mention was that there's kind of the idea that this is a representation of the plant world and of the cosmovision. So these sewn patterns are kind of a map of the communities, but also a map of what you see when you are communicating directly with some of these plants. And I feel like there might be some like lawsuit against a company like Urban Outfitters or something like that, who just took this style and put it on a t-shirt and made a ton of money and didn't give any credit to the artists who've been doing this for thousands of years. So it's something that is a great question that I should dig more deeply into, but I appreciate the attention and thought. Yeah.
So, couple questions on scale. I mean, obviously, 5 hectares is, as you noted, pretty small. And I just wonder how many plants are in the local people's pharmacopoeia? I mean, do they have hundreds of plants or thousands or dozens? And you know, while it's great to create a catalog, is there a sense of the scale of forests that would need to be protected to create a sort of natural preserve of the full pharmacopoeia?
So I think there's a proposal out right now, and again, I don't have the exact details offhand on this, but to create kind of a pan-indigenous Amazonian biosphere, so getting land rights to be given collectively to indigenous groups across Brazil and Peru to create just an ecological corridor. something like that would be incredibly hard to reinforce, but giving rights to indigenous people to have determination over their own land, I think, is the most important thing, first and foremost. And I know that conversation in Brazil with their current president is something tense and difficult, who I think he's advocating for transforming a lot of land in the Amazon into like cattle pastures and things like that, and that has a huge impact. I don't have a numerical sense of how much to be saved. I think it's kind of like the more the better. And I forgot your other question.
How many plants are in the...
Right. They've got about 400 different kinds identified so far, which I think speaks volumes to the biodiversity that Eva was speaking about in Costa Rica. It's a similar thing here in Peru.
You mentioned so many different like forms of knowledge when you were talking, from location to different names and different languages and like different things that the plants can do, and then also sort of this felt or known knowledge between particular people and plants. I'm just wondering how much of that is going to be in the catalog, and what form do they plan for it to take? Like, is it going to be written? Is it going to be online? Is it going to be like updatable?
Yeah, that's a really great question. From what I understand, it's just a spreadsheet right now, and I think they're still kind of in conversation about what that's going to look like. I think it might be a print final product, but I'm not sure. I'm imagining, because we are at MIT and there's so much that happens in the way of cool archive creation here online, I wonder if there's something that could be, but it's also a question of like, who is that knowledge for, right? People have cell phones, but is it like gonna translate in terms of the same ways that people kind of collect, gather, understand information? But yeah, I think it's a question mark and something that they're still in the early stages of figuring out. And I'd imagine that forms of collaboration, especially kinds that benefit the community directly, are something that they're really actively hoping to attract.
Are pharmaceutical companies going into the area to work with the indigenous inhabitants?
So I only know about this tiny project, and I don't think they've had any direct contact directly with pharmaceuticals right now, but it's something that they're open to the possibility of in the future. It's kind of a nebulous, like, what would we want to get out of this relationship type of conversation right now, but I don't think they've had any direct, yeah.
Okay, Devi, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks to all four of the speakers. One more round of applause for everybody who's presented. And now we're about to go on break from, we will resume at 1 p.m. This is, so that's what we're going to do now. Lunch will be ready shortly. We also need to take a class photo, do we not? So, Shannon.